Hi, I'm David Fuller, and welcome back to the reboot of the Yacht Business Podcast. In this series, I talk to people in the marine industry about how technology is changing their business. Technology such as AI and machine learning, augmented reality, IoT, the Internet of Things, blockchain, and perhaps even quantum computing. In this episode, I speak to Harry Spedding, General Manager of AutoNaut, about the technologies and edge cases involved with building autonomous wave-powered scientific research vessels. Let's dive into what we're here for then, shall we?
Yes. Right. I'll tell you how much I don't know about machine learning and AI.
Well, why don't you tell us who you are first, and then we can get into that.
Okay. Hi, my name's Harry Spedding. I'm the General Manager of a company called AutoNaut Limited, and we build essentially marine robots. They are wave-propelled, uncrewed surface vessels that go to sea for long endurance missions looking for metocean data, and we particularly look at passive acoustic data as well.
See, that's already gone over my head, but I like the piece about the wave power. How does that work? Or is that is that your special sauce? You're not allowed to talk about it?
Well, no, I'm happy to talk about it. There's 2 or 3 companies in the world that do this sort of thing, and we all have our own variation on a theme. We essentially have a set of foils that sit under the water, and they are sprung loaded, and as the vessel moves with pitch, roll, yaw, and heave. So essentially, as the vessel's moving up, down, left, right, all over the place, then that generates lift as the springs move under the water. So the lift of the aeroplane wing as such moves the vessel forward. The big advantage of that is that we're not reliant on fuel, and therefore we can do months and months and months at sea without worrying too much about power. Power is still a consideration for sensors and control systems, but we don't need to worry about refueling or carrying dangerous fuel. So, in terms of things like carbon emissions, we are zero, genuinely zero.
So, dumb question: what if there aren't any waves, or are there waves sort of deeper down, or
if it's absolutely mirror flat, then we won't move.
Okay.
We do have a little thruster that is battery powered that sits down on one of the legs for the foils. So if we have to, we can move the boat. But if you look out into the deep ocean, it's really rare that you find a mirror flat area that you want to have a look at. To be honest, most of the areas that the scientists want to investigate or that the meteorologists want to look at tend to be areas where you have a change in depth, or you have a particular weather system that operates there. So the actual center of a high, if you look at, well, for instance, where the Pacific garbage patch sits is the center of the high in the North Pacific. Well, in actual fact, even there, it's very rare that you have no wave movement whatsoever, and we need very little to keep moving. It doesn't matter whether it's an 8-meter wave or a 8-centimeter wave. We still just keep plodding along at 1.5 knots, 2 knots for months and months on end.
I guess what's the technology that has enabled this to happen? I guess the development of foiling tech, is that just all go back to Laird Hamilton, or is it older than that?
No, it's way older than that. So it's really interesting. So the technology of our propulsion is essentially foil design and springs, and that's you're talking Jules Verne in terms of, it kind of fits with the name of AutoNaut. I always felt that kind of comes from that Victorian age of exploration. But what's interesting is sitting alongside that quite old-fashioned technology, it needed new materials in order to be successful.
Okay.
So in terms of having springs that will last for 1 million repetitions, having the foil design that you can build with composites, so that you're getting the weight of the vessel and allowing it to move in the manner that allows for propulsion. That
I guess salt water never helps anything either, does it?
No, I mean, one of the most corrosive, barring something man-made and heading into volcanoes or heading out into outer space, it's one of the most corrosive things for things like metal springs. So I say we, people prior to me joining the company about 18 months ago, there was a lot of research done into different materials for the springs. But then alongside this very mechanical form of propulsion, we have our command and control system. That's very modern electronics, satellite controls. There's a degree of machine learning and AI in terms of understanding whether there's a adverse current or a positive current, whether the wind is blowing the bow off, so it needs to adjust its course when it's operating the autopilot, and also collision avoidance. So if we detect a ship nearby, the vessel will take avoiding action.
Is it connected to the internet all the time?
No, I mean, because of the costs, two types of costs: financial and power.
Right.
And currently, the majority of our power comes from solar charging of batteries. So everything we use, we need to manage and we need to control. When we look at, say, the command and control system, we need to have that operating at all times. So we need to understand exactly how that sits in our power management. If we're doing 24/7 satellite comms, then we are constantly transmitting, and transmission takes power. So we tend to do a 3-minute fix, something like that.
Okay. So you don't leave all the data on the vessel and then sort of download it at the end, or is there a combination?
Yeah. Well, a combination. So we've got a project underway at the moment where they will want to get the data back as fast as possible, as often as possible. But that's slightly a client concern. That's what they want. We did another mission end of last year. The vessel was at sea just over 3 months, 115 days. And during that period, we collected a terabyte of scientific data. Well, if you transmit all of that over Iridium satellite or Inmarsat or whatever system we're using, then it would cost a fortune. Some companies will do that. There's no two ways about it. If you've got the big survey companies, they have deals with satellite companies and they can do that. And they can afford to do it in terms of financial costs. But actually, is the value there in terms of the power cost? So if you send all the data back, well, actually, if you're not looking at it there and then, there's no value to sending it back instantly.
Sure.
Whereas we could collect it at the end of the 3 months. We then shared it with various institutes, and they spent months looking at the data. So there was no harm in. I mean, obviously, you're going to take a risk that you may not get the vessel back. Like any vessel at sea, things happen. But actually, you're sat in sunny Greece. We had Storm Arwen at the end of last year in the UK. It was blowing literally 100 miles an hour down off the Needles. And the interesting thing about the AutoNaut is the safe option for us is tell the vessel to stay at sea. It can quite happily sit out there in those conditions. And then at the end of it, once the storm had abated, we brought her in because we have to go, the last little bit with a support vessel and just bring her alongside.
Right.
I didn't want the team going out in Storm Arwen, so we waited until the weather was good and then went out and got her. And you're taking that risk that perhaps you don't get the data back. But the honest truth is, we're kind of designed for operating in those conditions.
And I'm assuming the data is stored on solid state sort of memory. So it's fairly difficult to, it's not a disk, it's not a spinning disk or something like that.
No, it's not. Yeah, exactly. And the advantage of solid state being, obviously, if we want to save power, we can shut stuff down and we don't lose that or get any corruption of the data.
There must be huge advances over the last few years in terms of all of these other technologies that you use. So, IoT and sensors and power consumption of those sensors. And I guess what's coming is these
I would say we
satellite
sit in a rather odd position there. So
Okay.
marine robotics is growing dramatically at the moment, to the extent that there are companies out there building bigger and bigger and bigger autonomous vessels. I think 73 meters is a vessel that's being built but is not currently fully autonomous. So we're talking big ships. That's not us. So where you get a sensor manufacturer design a new system, the power consumption doesn't tend to be at the forefront of their thought process in design. So
That's interesting, because I had read that some of the sensors that they're putting into buildings, for example, that are going to sit there for the life of the building, they are considering incredibly low power usage and things like that.
But what I would say is, for those sensors, you're looking at something that will sit there and be there for decades. But not only that, you're putting it into thousands and thousands of buildings.
Right.
What we're doing is looking at deep ocean science where there are not thousands and thousands and thousands of users. So you're talking about a smaller number of suppliers, you're talking about a smaller number of units being built, and the majority of the users actually tend to have a diesel generator or something like that. So it'll come, because power is something that we all talk about. We all want to be greener, we all want to be cleaner, and that all means using less power. So it will come, but I would say the majority of people who are building sensors are the sensor manufacturers are looking for the ultimate response from the sensor in terms of scientific data, not in terms of use of power. Now, there are anomalies to that. So, for instance, sensors that we put on the seabed that are battery operated, they need to go down there and they need to last us for as long as possible. So when we're looking at sensor manufacturers and users, if it's not a specific requirement of the client, which sometimes it can be, then we tend to do quite a lot of R&D into where the power management sits.
You talked about the cost of getting data through the existing satellite networks. What about some of these newer systems that are coming from Starlink or Amazon or whoever else is putting up these
Starlink
things?
is obviously the trendy name at the moment, and there's also OneStar, and there's a bunch of others. One of the bigger issues we have, and again, this slightly relates to our vessel and maybe 10 or 20 others that are similar to us in terms of size and movement. We move around quite a lot, and Starlink, for instance, currently couldn't cope with a vessel like ours, which moves. The antenna size is just too great. So we can work with a couple of others like Inmarsat and Iridium. Starlink, currently the antennas are all too big, too heavy. They need to be stable. As soon as you're talking about stabilizing the antenna, then you're talking about a load more power, a load more physics, a load more weight. So it becomes more complex. But the good thing is there are lots of people out there looking at lots of different things. So there will be different solutions coming through for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that people are talking about having, global internet, it's easy to throw that out there and say this is what we're going to achieve. It's actually quite difficult to achieve at sea. I mean, we talked about the difficulties with salt water, but you add in the movement of the waves and everything else, it becomes harder again.
Well, I'm speaking to a couple of people in Dubai at the moment about their solar farms, which are enormous, by the way. But traditionally, solar has not been very efficient in places like Dubai, just because of the amount of dust and sand. You lose a lot of things. So I've always had this thought, even in IT, right? It's one thing to be sitting in downtown Seattle or San Francisco or even London with your T1 line and expecting your latest gaming PC, totally. And without realizing that actually, they've got 5G in Dubai, but they don't have 5G in Greece.
So we have a similar problem with solar. Salt water dries out, leaves salt crystals. We had a vessel. It will eventually go to the Southern Ocean probably next year now. One of the things we were looking was ice covering on the solar panels. And now part of the investigations we did, I think we ended up working with 3 different PhDs on the research. Actually, if ice forms on the solar panels, you get a lens effect and you actually improve the solar. However, if when ice melts, the water dries and leaves the salt crystals behind, and then you have a different issue because the salt crystals have the same effect as the dust. So yeah, I mean, we've looked at hydrophobic coatings and all sorts of stuff, and then you get a seagull come along, and then you have another issue altogether.
Awesome. Those the edge cases that you never thought about.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
The buzzword in a lot of the places that I'm hanging around is blockchain. Is that a technology that you're even it's on the radar on the radar?
Yeah, I'd say we're aware of it. I've got some brains that work for me that when they start speaking, I get lost. There's been some thoughts that we, particularly when we look at autopilot design, when that gets more complex, that actually some blockchain could be used there to do the design work.
I'm just trying to think of user cases myself, but I'm not none are sort of flooding towards me.
So there's obviously a huge amount going on at the moment in the internet world, let's call it that, whether it's talking about Web 3.0 and ownership or talking about use of blockchain for research, or
in terms of the immutability of the blockchain, the fact that it can't be changed. I imagine that in some cases, the data that you were collecting, there may be a user case where you say, right, we lock that specific set of data into the blockchain and we can't change it. So we can't go back and fudge the data because it's sitting in a blockchain that can't be changed.
Possibly. So there was an uncrewed surface vessel USV company who pretty much, when they got set up a few years back now, they said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to go out, we're going to build. I mean, they managed to get a lot of funding, and they said, we're going to go out and we're going to get a load of data. And then essentially what we're going to do is sell the data rather than sell the use of the vessel. And the honest truth is that didn't work, because actually, if you say to a survey company, right, we've got data for this place for this period of time, they go, you can guarantee what they'll say is, yeah, but we don't need that period of time. We need this period of time.
Right.
So, I mean, I could see how for scientists being able to lock the data away and say, this is the raw data, this is as it was, you can't mess around with it. That's great, so long as you're 100% certain the sensors were fully calibrated, that wasn't a
there needs to be some sort of oracle that signs it off and says this is where it came from and whatever else.
And honestly, I don't think we're there. Again, bigger brains than mine work on the scientific side of this, and I don't think we're there.
AI and artificial intelligence, and the reason I assumed that you were using that is because you're an autonomous vehicle. I mean, everyone thinks when you say autonomous vehicles, they think of driverless Ubers. Autonomous vehicles have been around for a while, including yours. So, to what degree are you incorporating artificial intelligence into that?
I think there is a misunderstanding between AI and machine learning. So we use AI within our command and control system in terms of it's been given a set of parameters.
Sure.
And then something will change. It'll learn from that change, make an adjustment, but it doesn't remember the bit it just learned. It just makes the adjustment. So, for instance, our boat's going along in a straight line. It hits a bit of current that's hitting it on the right-hand side. It's drifting off course. It realizes that, it adjusts back, it goes back on course. But actually, if that current changes, it learns again and makes another change. Where we use machine learning, which is, to be honest, is probably the more complex and more interesting aspect, is within the sensors that we use. So AutoNaut is part of a group of 3 small businesses. So there's AutoNaut, there's Sage, and there's Ashridge. Sage work particularly with acoustics. Ashridge work with water quality. So the 3 companies kind of complement each other. And within the group, the 2 aspects of machine learning we're really looking at the moment. One is cameras for marine mammal observations. So particularly UK, US, Australia, there's a lot of offshore wind farm building going on. and say you've got a camera system that essentially what they're doing is teaching it to recognize when there is a blowhole from a whale or a fin or a tail or something like that. And once it's got a certain amount of data points, then it can continue to grow. And every time it finds something, we tell it, yes, that is a whale or a dolphin or whatever it may be. And that continues to grow its knowledge. Yeah. And then the other aspect that we do that with is, I guess, along the same lines in terms of marine mammals, but acoustics. So onboard processing is really data heavy at the moment and really power heavy. So if you think about an acoustic sensor, that the data you're saving is the equivalent of video. It's an audio track. So it's quite big in terms of data. If we can process that on board and then say, right, we've detected this whale singing off the east coast of the States, particularly the northern right whale, they transit through the areas that the wind farms will be, and therefore during building they want to make sure that they're not causing any issues. And I think there's only 400 of them left, so they're being really, for the US and Canada, they're being really protective of them. It's great to see. So if we can detect with a passive acoustic monitoring and then onboard process that acoustic data to say, oh, actually, we recognize that signal, then we can then autonomously send back a message to the seismic companies that are building the wind farm saying, you need to stop work, there is a whale in this region. So that the machine learning that's going on there, and the group work with Bath University, and I think there's like 3 or 4 PhDs again working on this aspect. That if we can do that processing and learning on board, then the ability of an uncrewed vessel to sit out sea for months on end and just relay a signal as and when necessary, that will be a game changer. I don't think anybody's there yet with it at the moment. Getting closer. There's a lot of learning to be done by the machines to say, actually, we're confident that what we're listening to is a harbour porpoise or a northern right whale or whatever it might be we're looking for.
I thought they'd got to a point where they could almost recognise individual animals, hadn't they? Or is that dolphin or dolphin?
Yeah, they can, but that requires a lot of looking at the data.
Right.
So it's not just a computer going, here's the noise, compare it to our library, this is what we think it is, this is what we're seeing.
Right.
So yeah, we're getting there. And the other thing is the power. We'll come back to, how much power consumption is required to run the processing system. Because of course, if I give it to a scientist at the Lost Project, we work with Sam, to Scottish marine scientists, they can plug it into their PC that is plugged into the wall that is getting 220.
Right.
And, currently they're probably wondering how much their electricity bill is going to be, but, they can churn that through. We're running it off a 12 or a 24 volt system that requires lithium batteries and solar charging. And that is where the real difficulty comes.
Are you an engineer by training?
Yeah, I am. Back in the day, 30-ish years ago.
I love the fact that it's a sort of the solutions and the R&D that you're doing is there to solve problems, and the problems are always, there's always new problems to solve. So
yeah, completely. And again, we're working in an environment that's so difficult to work in. Whether it's because there's a hurricane coming, or because there's seaweed on the foils, or because it's just salt water that will corrode everything. And there's so many things that are just involved because of the environment we work in. And then you add into that, actually, we want to operate for as long as possible using as little power as possible. It just adds curveballs to every single decision we make.
Are there still benefits from the high performance sailing world that are trickling down, whether it be foil design or wing sails or autopilot?
Do you know what I think? I think the greatest benefit is probably materials and understanding how to work with them.
I'm thinking specifically of something like the Vendee Globe, in terms of, you have that set of things. The boat's got to last for 3 months, and it's only got one person on board, and it's only got so much power, and it's only got so much, it's got to be a certain weight. But those constraints force those guys to innovate.
Interestingly enough, in terms of the people I work with, the majority of them have no knowledge of the sailing world whatsoever.
Right.
So at least I can bring some expertise. Yes, there are definitely, if you look at the computers that they're using on board, the IMOCA boats for the Vendee Globe, the power consumption they use, the way they control those. If you look at the solar panels that they are looking to build into vessels like that, there are big leaps forward, and it's not necessarily coming from their R&D, but their requirements push the suppliers to improve their R&D. And we have the same thing, but I would say we're probably smaller. Well, we're definitely smaller than a budget of an IMOCA team, I can tell you that much. But I think from the likes of, we were talking before the podcast about SailGP, so that has a huge amount of control systems involved in it. They do a lot of their stuff in-house, so you don't tend to see the trickle down.
Because it's come from the America's Cup kind of background of everything being still cloak and dagger and spies and
and a degree of controlling their budgets.
Right.
I mean, if you pay a company on the outside to produce a control system, well, that company wants to make a profit, so there's a margin on top of it, and therefore it costs you more. Whereas if you can employ somebody to produce a control system, but actually at the end of it, that project you can use them on another project, then financially that makes more sense. And SailGP is big enough to be able to do that.
Yeah, but I guess in sort of America's Cup, you can see some of those partnerships in play, like Airbus, for example, in working with American Magic.
I'd say this next America's Cup, probably we're going to see that more than anything else, because you've got 3, I think, of the America's Cup teams are now linked with Formula One teams.
Right.
I would imagine most of the Formula One teams probably see that as a distraction rather than a bonus. However, it probably also allows them to play with the salary cap. But that's a discussion for them.
Yeah.
But I think the more that you can collaborate, the more you are going to see trickle down. Trickle down's quite a hot topic in the UK.
I know last
week. And it's the same, to be honest. If you are doing your R&D internally to a team and keeping it to yourself because you want to protect your IP, then trickle down doesn't exist.
Right.
But if you employ an outside
supply, if you're pushing your third party supplier,
exactly,
that's a different story.
And where I would say, so completely different to this conversation, but if you look back at the last Volvo Ocean Race, the demands of the Volvo Ocean Race to their suppliers to be more sustainable actually probably made a bigger difference than anything else. And a simple example of that was they said to Musto that you need to reduce the amount of plastic that you use in the delivery of your clothing. Well, when Musto looked at that, they said, okay, well, if we put an extra fold in every pair of trousers, we're using a smaller plastic bag, we're using less plastic, that's good for sustainability. The knock-on effect, they looked at their P&L and they were using less plastic. It was cheaper. They were making more profit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the trickle down there is just that they shared those learnings with other people. I think if you look at an America's Cup team, and I totally get this, they want to protect their IP because it's about being competitive over a 4-year cycle.
Or longer, if you're Emirates Team New Zealand and you're inventing, controllers, game controllers to steer the boat or whatever else.
Well, for sure there is some trickle down for that, but it always takes longer than everyone thinks.
Of course.
Where we're operating is so completely different. There's a few material aspects, but we're not looking to build a carbon fiber boat because carbon blocks signals, because it's really light, and actually we want the boat to be a little bit heavier. There's a lot of reasons why we don't use some of the materials, but what we've been able to do is look at the learnings they've got of how the materials react
Yeah.
and say, okay, well, that helps us by the fact that we know not to use that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Harry. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, no worries. Good to see you again.
All right, Harry.
Cheers.